You probably think the security badge around your neck is just a key to the break room, but mine was a dead man's switch. When the CEO's son, Kieran, grabbed my lanyard and cut it with ceremonial scissors, he thought he was cutting dead weight from the payroll. He smiled at me, expecting tears. He didn't know that by severing that connection, he hadn't just fired me. He had just initiated a protocol to burn $5 billion of his father's company to the ground. Before I reveal how a single pair of scissors erased 15 years of government certification, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you've ever had an arrogant boss try to fix something that wasn't broken, hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you're going to enjoy the silence that comes next. My name is Dr. Eris Thorne, and I exist in the silent spaces between the zeros and ones that form the backbone of the United States defense infrastructure. For the last 15 years, I have served as the Chief Security Architect for Vanguard Systems, a specialized defense contractor buried deep within the quiet, pine-forested hills of Northern Virginia. My office is not located in the glass-fronted atrium where the marketing team drinks kombucha. It is 3 floors underground, in a climate-controlled bunker that smells faintly of ozone and static electricity. My position is not one of glamour, nor is it one that invites public accolades on LinkedIn. It is a role of absolute, unwavering precision, requiring the kind of discipline that does not allow for a single degree of deviation. Every morning at exactly 6:30, with the predictability of an atomic clock, I stand before the full-length mirror in my hallway, buttoning my crisp white blouse to the collar, preparing for a war that no one else can see. I do not carry a plastic access card. I do not use a simple 4-digit passcode, nor do I rely on a fingerprint scanner, which can be fooled by a high-resolution photograph and a piece of latex. Around my neck, suspended by a thick black woven lanyard, rests a heavy, titanium-encased hardware authenticator. To the untrained eye, it looks like an oversized identification badge, perhaps a cumbersome relic of the Cold War. But to the servers humming in the subterranean vault beneath my feet, this device is a living key. The lanyard itself contains a microfilament fiber optic core that maintains a constant light-speed handshake with the sensors embedded in the building's architecture. As long as that optical loop remains unbroken and detects the subtle, rhythmic, micro-movements of my pulse, the system understands that the custodian is safe, present, and uncompromised. It is a dead man's switch, a failsafe designed for high-threat environments, ensuring that if I were ever incapacitated, kidnapped, or if the device were forcibly removed, the system would know instantly. I am not just an employee. I am a biological component of the security infrastructure itself. For a decade and a half, this routine was the heartbeat of Vanguard Systems, protecting billions of dollars in federal contracts. We were the quiet professionals, the ones who ensured that sensitive data regarding national logistics and ballistic trajectories never fell into the hands of foreign adversaries. We operated in the shadows, a place where silence is the highest currency and redundancy is the only religion. I had built this cathedral of silence brick by brick, writing the code that governed the airlocks, designing the protocols that scrubbed the metadata, and personally vetting every engineer who was granted access to the inner sanctum. But silence, I learned the hard way, is often mistaken for obsolescence by those who measure value in noise, disruption, and the speed of a touchscreen interface. The disruption arrived on a humid Tuesday in September, driving a leased luxury sedan and wearing a suit that cost more than the annual budget of my internship program. His name was Kieran Ashford, the 28-year-old son of our chief executive officer, Lawrence Ashford. Kieran had spent the last 5 years in Silicon Valley, burning through $30 million of venture capital on failed applications that promised to revolutionize industries he didn't understand. He had now returned home to modernize his father's legacy, armed with an MBA from a university that prioritized networking over engineering, and a vocabulary entirely composed of hollow buzzwords. He was given the newly invented title of Vice President of Digital Innovation, a role that seemed to consist primarily of walking into rooms he did not understand and declaring that everything within them was broken. The atmosphere at Vanguard Systems changed the moment Kieran swiped his temporary badge at the front desk. It was a subtle shift at first, like the drop in pressure before a hurricane. The dress code, once strictly business professional, began to relax into a confused mix of hoodies and blazers. The quiet hum of focused work in the engineering bays was replaced by the loud, performative laughter of the new creative team Kieran had hired. a group of 20-somethings who spent more time designing slide decks than analyzing code. I watched this transformation from the glass-walled isolation of the Security Operations Center, feeling like a captain watching the rivets pop off the hull of a submarine. Kieran did not introduce himself to me during his first week. He did not ask for a briefing on the security architecture. Instead, on his third day, he simply walked past the Security Operations Center, glanced at the bank of monitors through the ballistic glass, and asked his assistant loudly enough for my entire team to hear why we were wasting prime real estate on a server farm when everything should be on the cloud. He looked at the server racks, the physical brain of our operation, and saw only wasted square footage that could be used for a ping-pong table or a meditation pod. That was the moment I knew he wasn't just a nuisance, he was a threat vector. The friction began in earnest with a slide deck. Kieran called a mandatory all-hands meeting in the main auditorium to unveil what he called Project Velocity. The email invitation had been marked with high importance and featured an animated graphic of a rocket ship, a frivolous touch that made my senior cryptographer grind his teeth. The auditorium was packed, the air conditioning struggling to keep up with the body heat of 300 employees. Kieran paced the stage, holding a wireless microphone like a stand-up comedian, pointing to a graph that showed our security protocols as a jagged red line trending downward. He claimed that Vanguard Systems was suffocating under the weight of its own compliance measures, that we were dinosaurs in an age of mammals. He spoke of frictionless access and democratizing data, phrases that sound wonderful in a marketing pitch for a coffee app, but are terrifying when applied to classified weapons schematics. He projected an image of a padlock shattering, the shards turning into birds flying away. It was a metaphor so clumsy, it was almost insulting. Then, he put up a slide that made the blood run cold in the veins of every engineer in the room. It was a picture of a standard security checkpoint, the very heavy, steel-reinforced doors that guarded our server wing, overlaid with a large, red X. He announced that within 48 hours, Vanguard would be transitioning to a third-party facial recognition system hosted on a public cloud server, eliminating the need for physical tokens entirely. He called it liberation. He smiled as he said it, waiting for applause. A few of the new marketing hires clapped enthusiastically, but the back half of the room, the engineers, the auditors, the people who actually built the systems, sat in stunned silence. I sat in the back row, my hands folded on my lap, feeling the heavy titanium token resting against my chest, its weight a comforting reminder of reality. He was not talking about liberation. He was talking about a breach of contract so severe it would be classified as gross negligence by the federal government. He was proposing that we take the keys to the kingdom, keys entrusted to us by the United States government, and hang them on a hook in the public square because the lock was too heavy to carry. I looked around the room and saw the fear in my team's eyes. They were looking at me. They weren't looking at the vice president, they were looking at the architect. They were waiting to see if the structure would hold. I did not raise my voice during the meeting. I did not stand up and make a scene. That is not how an architect operates. Emotion is a variable I removed from my workflow years ago. When the meeting ended, I walked back to my office, the sound of my heels clicking rhythmically on the linoleum, and drafted a request for a private audience with Kieran. I waited 3 hours for a response. When I finally entered the glass-walled conference room on the executive floor, the atmosphere was thick with the smell of expensive espresso and unearned confidence. Kieran was already celebrating, leaning back in a Herman Miller chair, scrolling through his phone while Jared Frey, the acting head of information technology, sat nervously at the edge of the table. Jared was a young man who had been promoted 3 levels above his competence simply because he never said no to Kieran. He was a yes man in a field that required no as a default setting. I placed a printed schematic of our network architecture on the table, smoothing out the paper with deliberate slowness. I began to explain, in a voice that was low and even, that the current authentication system was not a choice, but a federal mandate. "Mr. Ashford," I began, ignoring his casual wave of dismissal. "The architecture you are proposing to dismantle is not a legacy system. It is a condition of operation. The fiber optic lanyard I wear is a Class 7 hardware token. It is paired with the biological signature of the custodian. Removing it without a 48-hour de-escalation sequence triggers a defensive response from the central server." I pointed to the diagram, tracing the line from the physical token to the encryption vault. "This is not a door lock. It is a continuous biometric tether. The system detects continuity light and pulse, and a sudden severance of that continuity is interpreted as a hostile capture event. It assumes the custodian has been killed or coerced. Kieran looked at me with a mixture of pity and annoyance, as if I were speaking a dead language. He leaned back in his chair, putting his feet up on the table, right on top of my schematic, the rubber sole of his designer sneaker resting on the diagram of our encryption vault. He told me that I was overcomplicating things to justify my salary. He said that my generation was obsessed with hardware because we didn't understand the agility of software. He called my explanations technobabble and accused me of gatekeeping. "You're acting like this is the Pentagon, Eris," he said, chuckling. "It's a logistics company. We move boxes. We track shipments. Stop acting like you're guarding the nuclear codes." He looked at Jared and asked if we could override my protocols. Jared, sweating and avoiding my eyes, muttered that he could technically bypass the front-end alerts if he had administrative root access. Kieran smiled, a cold, predatory expression, and turned back to me. He issued an ultimatum. I was to hand over the root access codes and retire my ancient jewelry, or he would treat my refusal as insubordination. He claimed he was de-risking the company by removing a single point of failure. He did not understand that I was not the point of failure. I was the anchor. I was the only thing keeping the ship from drifting into the rocks. I left that meeting without handing over the codes. I knew, logically, that I could not stop him. Men like Kieran do not listen to warnings, they only listen to consequences. But I also knew that when the consequences arrived, they would look for a scapegoat. I returned to my office and did what any seasoned professional does when they see a train wreck approaching. I created a paper trail. I drafted a formal memorandum titled Notice of Intent to Interfere with Mandated Succession Protocols. In it, I detailed the exact time and nature of Kieran's orders. I documented Jared's admission that they intended to bypass safety alerts. I cited the specific federal acquisition regulations that were being violated, referencing the exact paragraphs of the National Industrial Security Program Operating Manual. I did not send this via email, where it could be deleted by an overzealous IT administrator or lost in a server purge. I printed 3 copies on watermarked company letterhead. I signed them in blue ink. I timestamped them using the official notary seal of the compliance office. I walked 1 copy down to Miriam Cole, our general counsel, and slid it under her locked door. I placed the 2nd copy in the fireproof safe in the server room. The 3rd, I kept in my briefcase. I was not preparing for a fight. I was preparing for an autopsy. The escalation was rapid and brutal. Over the next 24 hours, I watched the internal logs as Jared, under Kieran's pressure, began disabling the nuisance alarms, the very warnings that were designed to alert the executives of a security gap. The dashboard in my office, usually a calming sea of green, began to show flickering yellow warning lights. The system was getting nervous. It sensed that its perimeter was being probed by unauthorized entities. I sat at my desk, drinking black tea, and watched the digital walls tremble. I saw the requests coming from Kieran's executive suite, clumsy and loud, hammering against the firewall of the secure vault. He was trying to force the door open, not realizing that the door was holding back a flood. Every time a yellow light blinked, I logged it in my physical notebook. I noted the IP address, the timestamp, and the specific error code. My younger colleagues, the ones who hadn't yet been fired or transferred to the innovation team, looked at me with wide, fearful eyes. They wanted me to fix it. They wanted me to run down the hall and stop him. But I knew that you cannot save someone who is determined to jump. All you can do is ensure you are not tethered to them when they fall. By Wednesday afternoon, the tension in the building was so thick it felt physical. The air scrubbers in the ceiling were working overtime, but they couldn't filter out the smell of impending disaster. Kieran was strutting through the hallways, high on his own perceived disruption. He had already sent out a press release announcing the new Vanguard, a digital-first defense contractor. He hadn't even successfully migrated the email server yet, and he was already taking a victory lap. I stayed in the secure wing, checking the integrity of the backup generators, ensuring the Helen gas fire suppression system was active. I was checking the lifeboats while he was rearranging the deck chairs. The climax arrived on Thursday morning, bright and early. Kieran summoned the entire operations and compliance team to the main conference room for a milestone celebration. He wanted to publicly demonstrate the transition to the new system. The room was packed, the air conditioning struggling to keep up with the body heat. Kieran stood at the front, flanked by large monitors displaying the new, sleek login interface, which was nothing more than a customized skin over a fragile database. He spotted me in the second row and his eyes lit up. This was his moment. He invited me to the front of the room, his voice dripping with faux politeness. He announced to the crowd that Dr. Thorne was finally ready to embrace the future and symbolically retire the legacy hardware. He held out his hand, expecting me to take off the lanyard and give it to him. The room went silent. Hundreds of eyes were fixed on us. I remained still. I looked him in the eye and told him, calmly and clearly, that the device was government property and could not be surrendered without a chain of custody form. I spoke facts. He heard insults. Kieran's smile faltered, then hardened into a scowl. He was losing the audience, and his ego could not sustain the injury. He declared that he was the vice president of this company, and he was relieving me of duty effective immediately. He stepped forward, invading my personal space, his expensive cologne overpowering the sterile smell of the conference room. He reached out and grabbed the lanyard hanging around my neck. The sudden jerk pulled my head forward, the heavy titanium token digging into my sternum. He laughed, a sharp, nervous sound, and turned to the table where a pair of large, ceremonial scissors, the kind used for ribbon-cutting ceremonies, were lying on a velvet display cloth. He picked them up. The metal glinted under the fluorescent lights. He held the lanyard taut, the black woven fabric stretched tight between his hand and my neck. He announced that he was cutting the cord to the past. I did not scream. I did not struggle. I did not beg him to stop. To struggle would be to give him the satisfaction of a fight. Instead, I became a statue. I looked at the fiber optic cable, a miracle of engineering that carried light pulses like veins carry blood. I looked at the server room status light in the far corner of the ceiling, which was currently a steady, reassuring green, and then I looked back at him. I checked the time on the wall clock. 10:47 a.m. Kieran positioned the blades of the scissors around the lanyard. He squeezed his hand. There was no explosion, no sparks, no dramatic sound effect. Just a dry, crisp snip. The tension released instantly. The severed bottom half of the lanyard, heavy with the titanium authenticator, fell from his hand and clattered onto the polished conference table. The sound echoed in the silence of the room, like a gavel striking a bench. Kieran held up the scissors in victory, grinning at the stunned employees. He thought he had just won a political victory. He had no idea that he had just physically severed the optical handshake with the central server. The system, detecting the sudden, violent loss of continuity, did not interpret this as a resignation. It interpreted it as the assassination or capture of the primary custodian, and it initiated the response I had programmed it to execute 15 years ago. I stood there for a moment, feeling the lightness around my neck, a phantom sensation where the weight had been for a decade. I looked at the severed token lying on the table, lifeless, now that the light had stopped flowing through it. I looked at Kieran, who was waiting for me to cry or to yell. Instead, I picked up my briefcase from the floor. I turned to the room, to the faces of the people I had worked with for years. Sarah from logistics, Mark from auditing, people who had families and mortgages, and I felt a pang of sorrow for them, but I said nothing. There was nothing left to say. The system was now speaking for me. I turned around and walked toward the door, my heels clicking rhythmically on the carpet. The countdown had begun, and I intended to be outside the blast radius when the silence ended. As I walked down the hallway toward the elevators, the world behind me seemed to pause. The usual hum of the office, the printers, the chatter, the typing felt distant, muffled by the magnitude of what had just occurred. I pressed the call button for the elevator and waited. 30 seconds passed. I could hear the faint sound of applause fading from the conference room. They were clapping for their own destruction. When the elevator doors slid open, I stepped inside and pressed the button for the lobby. As the doors began to close, I saw Jared Frey sprinting down the hallway, his face pale, his phone pressed to his ear. He was shouting something about the dashboard, about the lights turning red. I let the doors close, sealing him out. The descent to the lobby was smooth, quiet. I took a deep breath, adjusting my blazer. I walked past the security desk in the lobby, giving a polite nod to the guard, a man named Marcus who had been there almost as long as I had. He smiled and waved, unaware that the monitors behind him were about to go dark. I pushed through the revolving doors and stepped out into the humid Virginia air. The sun was shining, birds were singing. It was a beautiful day for a catastrophe. I walked to my car, a sensible sedan parked in my assigned spot, and unlocked the door. I did not get in immediately. I stood there, leaning against the doorframe, and checked my watch. 4 minutes had passed since the cut. Inside the building, the dead man switch protocol would now be reaching its second phase. The first phase was the silent alarm, a ping sent directly to the National Security Agency and the Department of Defense, notifying them that the integrity of the secure vault at Vanguard Systems had been compromised via a Priority 1 custodian severance event. That ping had likely been received 3 minutes ago. The second phase was the internal lockdown. I imagined the scene upstairs. The screens in the conference room would flicker. The celebratory slideshow of Project Velocity would freeze. Then, the projectors would cut to black. The Wi-Fi would drop. Every laptop connected to the secure internal network would suddenly lose its handshake with the server. But it wasn't just a loss of internet, it was a cryptographic shredding event. The servers in the basement, sensing that the custodian had been neutralized, were now systematically deleting the encryption keys required to read any of the data stored on them. They were not deleting the files. That would take too long. They were destroying the Rosetta Stone needed to read the files. Without those keys, terabytes of classified data blueprints, communication logs, financial records were instantly transforming into digital garbage, random noise, irrecoverable. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was a text message from an automated number, a service I had subscribed to years ago that monitored the status of federal contractor certifications. The message was short and brutal. Alert. Vanguard Systems. Facility clearance revoked. Status. Suspended. Reason. Security breach. I stared at the screen. It was done. 15 years of building a fortress, of passing every audit, of maintaining a 99.9% uptime, all undone in the span of a single morning meeting. Kieran had wanted to move fast and break things. He had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. I got into my car, placed my phone in the center console, and started the engine. As I pulled out of the parking lot, my dashboard navigation system flickered as a proximity alert appeared. A series of heavy, unmarked vehicles were approaching the perimeter at high speed. The retrieval team, they weren't coming to fix the computers, they were coming to secure the physical premises and likely arrest whoever was in charge. I didn't speed up. I didn't look back. I drove at exactly the speed limit, heading toward the highway, toward home, toward a very long, quiet afternoon of tea, and perhaps a good book. The silence I had warned them about had finally arrived, and it was deafening. I imagined Kieran standing in the dark conference room, holding the scissors, watching the red lights blink on the corrupted hard drives, finally realizing that gravity is not something you can negotiate with. He had cut the cord, and now he was falling. The drive away from the Vanguard Systems campus was a study in sensory dislocation. Outside the insulated glass of my sedan, the world continued with an infuriatingly mundane rhythm. Delivery trucks idled at intersections, pedestrians jaywalked with their eyes glued to smartphones, and the sun beat down on the asphalt with a cheerfulness that felt almost mocking. But inside the cabin of my car, and more importantly, inside the architecture of my mind, there was only a deafening, resounding silence. I did not need to be standing in the sub-basement Level 3 server vault to know exactly what was transpiring at this very second. I had written the choreography myself, line by line, over a decade ago. I knew that the cooling fans, usually screaming at 10,000 revolutions per minute to dissipate the heat of heavy computation, were now spinning down to a mournful, low idle whine. I knew that the status monitors lining the wall of the Security Operations Center screens that I had watched for 15 years, like a captain watching the horizon, were currently displaying nothing but the stark, unforgiving black of a powered-down terminal. It was not a malfunction. It was not a glitch. It was a funeral. I reached the highway and merged into traffic, keeping my speedometer locked precisely at the legal limit. Discipline is not a coat you take off when you leave the office. It is the skin you live in. My phone, resting in the center console, began to vibrate. It was a harsh, insistent buzzing against the hard plastic. I glanced at the screen. The name displayed was Jared Frey, acting IT director. I did not answer. To answer would be to engage. And I was no longer an engaged asset. I was a civilian. Civilians do not have the security clearance to discuss the active meltdown of a classified Department of Defense network. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. Then it rang again. This time, it was an unknown number, likely a frantic junior executive trying to bypass the blocked internal directory. I reached over, my hand steady, and silenced the device, placing it face down. I was not ignoring them out of spite. I was adhering to the strict parameters of the situation they had created. The protocol for a severed custodian connection is absolute isolation until a federal auditor establishes a clean chain of custody. By not answering, I was technically being the most compliant employee they had ever had. When I arrived at my townhouse, the silence of my living room felt different than it had that morning. It felt heavy, earned. I placed my keys in the bowl by the door and walked to the kitchen. I filled the kettle with water and set it to boil. The ritual of making Earl Grey tea, measuring the loose leaves, warming the pot, waiting for the steep, provided a tactile anchor to a reality that felt like it was dissolving. As the steam rose from the cup, I walked to the living room and turned on the television, tuning it to a global financial news network. It was too early for the specific details to have leaked, but I watched the ticker tape scrolling at the bottom of the screen, waiting for the first tremors of the earthquake I had just walked away from. It took 45 minutes. At 11:32 a.m., my personal email, the secure channel I had listed on my government emergency contact forms, pinged with a notification. It was not from the company. It was an automated alert from the Defense Counterintelligence and Security Agency, DCSA. The subject line was stark, capitalized, and terrifying to anyone who understands the industry. Notice of Facility Clearance Invalidation. I sat down in my armchair and opened the message on my tablet. It was a form letter, cold and bureaucratic, generated by a machine that does not know how to feel pity. It stated that the facility code, cage code, associated with Vanguard systems had been flagged for a critical continuity failure. The automated watchdogs at the Pentagon had attempted to perform their hourly cryptographic handshake with our servers. They had reached out across the secure network, knocking on the door, expecting the correct mathematical answer. Instead, they found a void. The encryption keys had been shredded. The digital door was not just locked, it had been bricked over. Consequently, the automated system had immediately severed the contract link to prevent any potential data exfiltration. The 15-year certification, the golden ticket that allowed Vanguard to bid on multi-billion-dollar logistics contracts, had been revoked in less time than it took Kieran Ashford to finish his morning latte. The email was not a warning, it was a death certificate for the company's current operational status. I took a sip of my tea. It was hot, grounding. The phone rang again. This time, the caller ID displayed a name I could not ignore. Miriam Cole, General Counsel. Miriam was a woman of iron nerves, a lawyer who had stared down congressional subcommittees without blinking, a woman I respected for her ability to navigate the gray areas of corporate law. But when I answered, her voice was unrecognizable. It was high, thin, and trembling with a frequency of panic I had never heard from her. "Eris," she gasped, the sound distorting over the connection. "Thank God. You have to come back. Now. Right now, the FBI is at the gate. The cyber response team is seizing the physical logs. Kieran is screaming at the agents, threatening to sue them for trespassing. It's... Eris, the system is gone. Everything is gone. The screens are black." I spoke slowly, keeping my voice level, the voice of an architect describing the structural integrity of a collapsed bridge. "The system is not gone, Miriam. It is secure. It executed the Scorched Earth protocol exactly as designed. The data hasn't been stolen. It has been cryptographically shredded to prevent unauthorized access. The system assumed the custodian me had been captured or compromised. It protected the asset by making it unreadable." "Captured?" she shrieked. "Kieran cut a piece of plastic. He didn't capture you." "Eris, listen to me. You have to come back and type in the override code. We need to restore the keys. The Department of Defense just issued a stop work order on the logistics project. That's a $5 billion contract, Eris. We are bleeding out. Fix it." I paused, letting the silence on the line stretch out, forcing her to hear the weight of her own request. "Miriam, you are asking me to undo a chemical reaction. You are asking me to unburn a match. There is no override code. The protocol is designed to be irreversible. That is why it is a Class 7 security measure. If there were a way to reverse it quickly, a torturer could force me to use it. That is the point. The only way to restore the keys is to rebuild the entire architecture from the cold storage backups." "Fine!" she shouted. "Do that. How long does it take? An hour? 2? The backups are kept on magnetic tape in a climate-controlled salt mine in Utah, I said, my voice devoid of emotion. We have to physically transport them. We have to re-verify the checksums. We have to rebuild the operating system environment. The process takes minimum 6 months and requires a full recertification audit by the federal government. There was a long, suffocating silence on the other end of the line. I could hear shouting in the background, the distinct, hysterical voice of Kieran Ashford blaming faulty legacy hardware and screaming about sabotage. 6 months? Miriam whispered, the fight draining out of her. We don't have 6 months. We have payroll on Friday. We have deliverables due on Monday. If we stay offline for 48 hours, we trigger the default clauses in our bank loans. The company will be insolvent. I know, I said. I wrote the risk assessment report that warned of this exact scenario. I submitted it to the board 3 years ago. I believe you have a copy in your files, assuming you printed it out before the servers wiped themselves. If not, it is currently a pile of digital ash. Kieran says you did this on purpose, she said, her voice hardening slightly, the lawyer in her instinctively trying to find a defensive angle, a throat to choke. He says this is malicious destruction of corporate property. He says you triggered it manually. Kieran physically severed the continuous biometric tether. I corrected her, my tone sharpening like a scalpel. I have 300 witnesses and a room full of people who saw him hold the scissors. I also have a time-stamped intent to interfere memo that I slid under your door yesterday. I am not the saboteur, Miriam. I am the whistleblower who was ignored. If you attempt to blame this on me, I will testify before the Oversight Committee, and I will bring my own private logs. And unlike Kieran's slide decks, my logs are accurate. The line went dead. She had hung up. I placed the phone back on the table. I did not feel triumph. I felt a profound, exhausting clarity. They were finally reading the manual, page by page, in the dark. The next 3 days were a blur of contrast. In my home, there was peace. I read books. I tended to my garden, pruning the roses with a pair of shears that felt heavy and significant in my hands. But in the world outside, the noise was deafening. By Thursday, the story had leaked to the defense industry trade journals. Major contractor goes dark, read one headline on a prominent defense blog. Data loss event at Vanguard Systems triggers federal probe, read another. I watched from a distance as the narrative shifted. At first, there were rumors of a Chinese cyber attack. Then, speculation about a sophisticated ransomware gang. But the truth, as it always does, began to seep out through the cracks. Anonymous employees, likely the engineers I had trained and protected, began leaking details on encrypted forums. They spoke of the Project Velocity town hall. They spoke of the golden scissors. They spoke of the sheer, breathtaking arrogance of a vice president who thought he could disrupt a security protocol with a pair of ribbon-cutting shears. On Friday afternoon, a courier arrived at my door. He did not look like a delivery man. He looked like a paralegal who had drawn the short straw. He handed me a thick envelope on heavy, cream-colored stationery with the Vanguard watermark. It was a formal letter from the board of directors. They were not suing me. They were inviting me to an emergency consultation session. The language was polite, almost deferential, stripped of all corporate buzzwords. They wanted to hire me as an external specialist to assist in the remediation and recovery of critical assets. I did not respond immediately. I let the weekend pass. I let them sweat through a payroll cycle where checks had to be written by hand because the automated system was bricked. On Monday morning, I put on my charcoal blazer. I placed my new visitor badge around my neck, a simple piece of plastic with no electronics, a stark contrast to the titanium weight I was used to, and drove back to the facility. The parking lot was a ghost town. The black SUVs of the FBI were gone, replaced by the modest, gray sedans of federal auditors. When I walked into the lobby, the reception desk was unmanned. The plants were wilting. The air in the building felt stagnant, the hum of the servers noticeably absent. It was a building in a coma. I walked past the empty security desk, my heels clicking on the marble, echoing in the void. I was directed to the executive conference room, the same room where Kieran had performed his little theater piece less than a week ago. The scene inside was like a tableau of defeat. Lawrence Ashford, the CEO, sat at the head of the table. He looked 20 years older. His skin was gray, his eyes rimmed with red, his tie loosened. Miriam Cole sat to his right, clutching a stack of files as if they were a life raft. And in the corner, staring at the floor, sat Kieran. He was no longer wearing the expensive Italian suit. He was in a wrinkled dress shirt, his sleeves rolled up, looking like a college student facing expulsion. He did not look at me when I entered. "Dr. Thorne," Lawrence said, his voice raspy, as if he hadn't spoken above a whisper in days. "Thank you for coming. We are in a difficult position." I sat at the opposite end of the table. I did not open my briefcase. I folded my hands on the polished wood, right next to the faint scratch mark where the scissors had landed. "I am aware of the position, Lawrence. The industry is calling it a catastrophic decertification. It is a textbook case study in why operational security supersedes executive privilege. We need the data back," Lawrence continued, a note of desperation creeping into his voice. "The auditors are saying that without the encryption keys, the hard drives are just paperweights. They're talking about revoking our charter permanently. We need you to tell us how to bypass the protocol you wrote." "I cannot bypass it," I said, meeting his gaze. "I told Miriam this. The encryption is mathematical. It doesn't care about your charter. It doesn't care about your stock price. The keys are gone. They were overwritten 7 times by a random number generator. That data is dust. If you try to recover it from the live drives, you will find nothing but static." Kieran made a noise, a sharp intake of breath, but he didn't speak. He was shrinking in his chair, making himself small. "However," I continued, "I can help you salvage the hardware infrastructure. I can help you guide the recovery team to the Utah backups. I can help you draft the incident report for the Department of Defense in a way that might allow you to retain a probationary license for non-classified logistics. But I will not do this as an employee. That bridge has been burned." Lawrence nodded slowly. "We assumed as much. What are your terms?" I slid a single sheet of paper across the polished table. "I will work as an independent lead crisis consultant. My rate is $2,500 per hour, with a guaranteed non-refundable retainer for 300 hours paid up front. I require full, unqualified legal indemnity for the event of last Tuesday, signed by every member of the board. And I require a public statement, released to the press and the industry wire, clarifying that the security breach was a direct result of unauthorized executive interference, and that the compliance officer, me, followed all correct procedures." Miriam gasped, looking at the paper. "Eris, the rate, that's exorbitant. And the public statement, the reputational damage to Kieran, would be permanent." I looked at Kieran. For the first time, he looked up. His eyes were wet. He looked terrified. He looked like a boy who had broken a priceless vase and was waiting for the punishment. "The reputational damage has already occurred, Miriam," I said softly. "The industry knows what happened. The engineers have talked. The only question is whether you want to admit it and salvage the company, or lie about it and lose everything. If you want me to help you rebuild the house, you have to admit who burned it down. As for the rate, you aren't paying for my time. You are paying for the 15 years of knowledge that allows me to fix the mess you made in 15 seconds. Lawrence looked at his son. It was a long, painful look. It was the look of a father realizing that his blind spot, his nepotism, had cost him his legacy. He closed his eyes and nodded. "We accept." The recovery process was not a montage. It was a grueling physical ordeal. 2 days later, I found myself on a private charter plane, heading to Utah, accompanied by 2 armed federal marshals and a team of technicians. We drove into the desert, to a facility carved deep into the side of a mountain, a salt mine repurposed as a data fortress. The air inside was dry and tasted of mineral dust. We walked through miles of tunnels, past rows of magnetic tape libraries that held the sleeping memories of the defense industry. Locating our specific archive crates took 4 hours. Physically loading the heavy, lead-lined boxes onto the transport truck took another 3. This was not the cloud. This was not frictionless. This was heavy, manual labor. It was the physical weight of data. Back in Virginia, the restoration process was equally arduous. We had to wipe every server clean, reinstall the operating systems from trusted media, and then begin the slow, agonizing process of ingesting the data from the tapes. I worked 16-hour days, fueled by black tea and sheer willpower. I was no longer the silent custodian in the basement. I was the oracle. The engineers who remained treated me with a reverence that bordered on fear. They saw me as the person who had summoned the lightning and was now the only one who could bottle it. Kieran was removed from his position 48 hours after our meeting. The official press release stated that he was stepping down to pursue personal interests in the startup sector. In reality, he was quietly shuffled into a non-executive role at a subsidiary company that manufactured cardboard packaging, far away from any digital infrastructure or decision-making power. The last I heard, he was facing an investigation by the Securities and Exchange Commission regarding the representations he had made to investors about the Project Velocity initiative. He had wanted to disrupt the industry. He ended up disrupting his own life. Vanguard Systems survived, but it was a shadow of its former self. The lucrative logistics contract was lost, awarded to a competitor who had a valid facility clearance. The company downsized by 40%. The innovation team, the marketing gurus and slide deck designers, was let go in the first round of layoffs. The ping-pong tables were sold. The open plan office was partitioned back into cubicles. Reality had returned. 6 months later, on my last day as a consultant, I stood in the lobby of the newly recertified building. The servers were humming again. A deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the floorboards. It was a new song for a chastened company. Lawrence Ashford walked down to shake my hand. He looked tired. A man who had survived a shipwreck but lost his fortune. "We're back online," he said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Green lights across the board. Thanks to you." "The system works, Lawrence," I said, adjusting my scarf. "It always worked. It just required respect. Technology is not a toy. It is a tool. And tools have rules." I walked out to my car. The final check for my consulting fees deposited in my account, a sum that secured my retirement, though I had no intention of retiring. My phone buzzed. It was a recruiter from a specialized agency in Washington, D.C., one that handled high-level placements for the National Security Agency and Cyber Command. "Dr. Thorne," the voice on the line said, respectful and crisp. "We heard about the recovery operation at Vanguard. We read the incident report. The way that system defended itself. It was a masterpiece of architectural denial. We have a director role opening up at the Directorate of Operations. We need someone who understands that security isn't about saying yes to executives. It's about knowing exactly when and how to say no." I smiled, looking at the new badge in my hand, a sleek, government-issued smart card with a holographic chip that felt reassuringly heavy. "I'm listening," I said. I drove away from Vanguard Systems for the last time, leaving the silence behind me. In the corporate world, arrogance is loud. It demands attention. It breaks things just to hear the sound of the crash. But competence? Competence is quiet. It is the hum of a server room that never goes down. It is the lock that refuses to pick. It is the safety net that catches you only when you fall, and the wall that stands firm when you run into it. Kieran Ashford wanted to disrupt the silence. He wanted to make noise. He succeeded. But in the end, it was the silence that had the final word. And as I merged onto the highway, heading toward a new skyline and a new vault, I knew one thing for certain. I would never apologize for being the anchor. Because when the storm comes, the anchor is the only thing that matters. In a corporate world that often rewards the loudest voice, I proved that silence is not surrender. It is strategy. True power doesn't need to shout. It simply needs to be built on a foundation so strong that it speaks for itself long after you walk away. If you have ever had to quietly pack your box and leave a place that was too arrogant to understand your worth, know that your competence is your armor. You are not alone. If my story spoke to you, please like, comment, and share it with someone who is still learning to trust the power of their own silence.